Okay, so since we're just coming from Lag BaOmer, I thought I would learn something or talk about an inyan that's not so clearly understood in something Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai said. Is a very famous statement, but he said as follows: "There's a Gemara in Sukkah, Daf Mem Hey Amud Beis, where Chizkiah reports in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah, in the name of Rashbi, that Rabbi Rashbi said the following: Yachol ani liftor es kol ha'olam kulo min hadin. I could Potter, how do you say Potter? I could exempt the whole world from din, from judgment. Miyom shenivrasi, from the day that I was created, ad ata, until this point in time. Eliezer b'ni imi, and if my son Eliezer would be with me, miyom shenivra olam ad achshav, from the day that the world was created until now, not just from when I was created, but from the day that the world was created until now. Yochai ben Uziyahu, and if Yochai ben Uziyahu, he was one of the Malchei Yisrael, Yochai, I'll explain in a minute. Then Miyom Shenivra Ha'olam Ad Soifoi, from the day that the world was created until the end of the world. Now, who was Yotam ben Eliyahu? Yotam ben Eliyahu was ben Uziyahu was one of the Malchei Yisrael, one of the kings of Israel, actually from Malchus Yehuda. And he was one of the very few in his time, one of the very few righteous kings. In fact, his father was actually the king Uziyahu, and he became a Metzoira. He became leprous. He had leprosy or tzarat. And his son Yotam took over the Malchus, but never ascribed it to himself. He took over the kingship, but never really ascribed it to him with his father's. Say again?
Is he the one that got the last because he touched kahuna?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And in any event, that was the father, and the son Yotam took over the kingship, and everything that he did and all the successes that he had, he ascribed to his father and not to himself. So it was an onov, and so on. So the question is, like, why was it that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, like what was behind this idea that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai said I could exempt the entire world from judgment and from din, from severity and harsh judgments and so on? Like, what's the basis of it? So there's two explanations in general. Rashi says because of the schus of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, because of his tremendous his chusim, how do you say chusim? Because of his the good things that he did, because of his merits, he was rewarded with the possibility of exempting the entire world from judgment. And if you add in the merits of his son Rabbi Elazar and the merits of Yotam again, who showed tremendous respect for his father, despite the fact that his father was a Metzoira, and a Metzoira Choshiv Kameis, besides the fact that his father was leprous and is regarded as, in a sense, dead, he showed tremendous respect for his father, and therefore that is why that's the reason, according to Rashi anyway, as to why he was able to exempt the entire world from judgment. There's another commentary, the Maharsha, who says because of their Yisurim. All of these people that we mentioned, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, and Yotam, all went through a tremendous amount of suffering, and because of their suffering, they could exempt the world from that, took all the suffering of the world upon themselves. However, these explanations seem a little bit like not really, I don't know, they don't hit the mark so well. So we have to look elsewhere for explanations. But in order to explain it properly, we have to look elsewhere. There are two other times in the Gemara where the Gemara talks about someone who was able to exempt the entire world from judgment. The first one is in Masechet Bava Basra, on page 16a, Zion Aleph, where Rava, the great sage Rava, says as follows, that Bikesh Iyov Liftoris Oilam is Kol Oilam Kulam Adin. Iyov, Job, wanted to exempt the entire world from judgment. And he said like this, what was his argument before HaKadosh Baruch Hu? His argument was, Omar Lafanav, he said before the Almighty, Rabboni Shel Olam, Master of the world, Baras Hashor, you created the ox, Parasois of Sadukois, and you created him with split hooves, and therefore he's kosher. Chamoir, you created a donkey, Parasois of Klutois, and his hooves are not split, and therefore it's not a kosher animal. Continues, Barasa Gan Eden, Barasa Gehenim, you created the Garden of Eden, you created hell, Hagan Gehenim, purgatory. Barasa Tzadikim, you created Tzadikim, Barasa Rashoim, you'll probably recognize this from Tanya, you created Tzadikim and you created the wicked, you created the righteous, you created the wicked. Mi ma'akav al yadcha, who would have been able to prevent you? Was anyone holding you back? So the implication, therefore, is since you, Hashem, created tzaddikim and you created Rashoim, so what do you want from them? They're not responsible for their actions. You're the one who created them. You created them as wicked people, and therefore, it's not possible for them to be anything else. It's not possible for them to be righteous. And in this way, he tried to exempt the entire world from din. But Eeyob's friends, who were, if anything, simply foolish, they came back and they said to him, wait a minute, the Gemara records, they came back to him, and what did they say to him? The Eeyob's friends came back and answered him as follows. You've undermined people's fear and awe of God, and you've diminished the possibility of prayer, because if people feel that the way they're created is the way that they're going to stay, they're not going to have any fear of God. Well, you created me that way, and therefore there's nothing to be done. And diminished prayer, because no one's going to pray for change. So what therefore did Hashem do? What did God do instead? Bara HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yetzer Hara. He created the Yetzer Hara, but bara lo Torah tavlin. He created the Torah as an antidote, as tavlin, as spices, in order to heal. As we know that spices were used a lot in healing in those days. He created the Torah as the spices whereby, or the herbs whereby, to heal the issues of the Yetzer Hara. So Eeyov therefore was not successful in exempting the world from judgment. There's a third case that the Gemara talks about, and this is in Masechet Eruvin, Samach Daled Amud Beis, and the Gemara says as follows: Omar Rav Sheshes Mishum Rabbi Elazar ben Azarya. And Rav Sheshes says in the name of Elazar ben Azarya. Elazar ben Azarya was a very famous sage in the time of the Gemara, and he became the head of the Sanhedrin at a very, very young age. And his wisdom was basically unparalleled, even from a very young age. At the age of 18, he became, as we know from the story in the Haggadah, I'm like a 7-year-old man, even though he was only 18 at the time. And he had white in his beard. He grew white in his beard to show that he had the wisdom, etc. In any event, he also said, I too can exempt the entire world from judgment from the time of the Beis Hamikdash, that the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed ad achshav, until our times. Shene'emar, as it says, Lochein shimina zois aniya v'shechoires v'lo miyayin. Listen now, there's a verse from Yeshaya. Listen now, the poor woman, v'shechoires, and drunk, the poor drunk woman, v'lo miyayin, but not from wine, drunk, but not from wine. What was she drunk from? Commentaries explain that this is talking about Bnei Yisrael, essentially. It's talking about the Jewish people, that with the destruction and the suffering that they went through, they were as if they were drunk. In other words, they weren't in control of themselves. They could not focus properly. They were in a sort of in a drunken stupor as a result of the destruction of the temple and the difficulties of the exile. And therefore, because they were in a state of this state of drunkenness, even though they hadn't drunk anything per se, but because they were in the state, therefore they're potter from din. They're potter from din. So the Gemara asks the question and says as follows. It says, the Gemara asks the question, Shikor mekach, a person who's drunk, his business transactions are regarded as valid. In karamemkar, if he sold something, it's a sale. Over avera, if he did a sin, in which the punishment would be death, for instance, if he murdered somebody or something like that, or whatever the Zora, he would be put to death by the Beis Din, even though he was drunk. Malkois, and if the punishment was malkois, was to be whipped, then malkinoi, so he would indeed be whipped. In other words, he would get his punishment, despite the fact there's no argument that he was drunk, right? The fact that he was drunk is neither here nor there. If he's responsible, he's responsible. Malkinoi, so klal shel davar, and the general rule is harehu kapikayach chol dvarav. He is like a pikayach. He's like someone who is in control of his senses in every possible way. Only what? What did Rabbi Elazar ben Azarya mean? Ela shepoter min atfilah. He's potter from davening, because since he can't pray when he's drunk, therefore he is exempt from prayer. So what does that mean? Therefore, when he said I could exempt the entire world from judgment, I could exempt them from prayer. That's what Rabbi Elazar ben Azari meant. What does this mean? It seems to be a bit of a mystery what's going on over here. So there's a person named the Chidah. Chidah was a Sephardi Makubal, a very interesting Chaim Yosef David Azula, a very interesting Makubal who brings a number of very important and interesting insights into all kinds of different things in all aspects of the Torah, and he explains this as well. He says as follows, that the exile and the poverty, the spiritual poverty that a person experiences, they remove him from thinking about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In other words, al das koinu, he doesn't think about Hashem because he's so troubled with his pain and his suffering and his poverty and so on and so forth. He can't think straight. So therefore, he's not able to, according to the Gemara that we just learned, he's not able to daven, he's not able to pray properly. And therefore, although he is not apparently exempt according to the Gemara, but he should be exempt from all kinds of judgments. Why? Because since he is not in his right mind, and the only way a person can be exempt is from his judgment is through prayer, and he's now exempt from prayer, therefore he's exempt from all kinds of other because he can't pray, he's exempt from all of the judgments, etc. Okay, so these are the various answers that are given, but they still don't seem to be satisfactory. Why was it that Rabbi Shimon was able to exempt the entire world from judgment and nobody else was apparently that successful, other than Job was not successful at all, because after all, there is Torah, and if people learn Torah, they'll be able to take care of the Yetzer Hara. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was not that successful either, because he only exempted people from prayer, and even though prayer, it helps that if one can't pray, one can be exempt from judgment. But it seems that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was telling us something much more substantial. And the idea I heard was as follows: beautiful idea, beautiful explanation of it. Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai has a certain shita in halacha, a certain path in halacha. In many cases, in several cases, right throughout the Shas, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai argues that a person who does something below miskavein, if he does something that's not bekavona, he does it without intention, then it's either mutar or potter. At best, at worst, potter. In other words, even if he did something which he shouldn't have done. You would think that he shouldn't have done. Nevertheless, he's potter. For example, we have an example of this. A person walks over the grass, let's say, and his shoes, because he's walking over the grass, his shoes uproot a blade of grass or a stalk of grass from where it was growing on Shabbos. That l'chayre is he did something, even though it's b'shoigeg. Nevertheless, he shouldn't have done it. He shouldn't have walked over the grass. Rabbi Yehuda, in fact, says not only is he chayav, not only is he chayav, but he's chayav min haTorah. It's not chayav min Rabbanan. He's chayav min haTorah. The Torah makes him into puts him in a situation where he is actually chayav. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says. Rabbi Shimon comes along and says, no, he's potter. Why? Because he had no intention of uprooting the grass. He was walking over the grass. He wanted to go somewhere. And therefore, as he was walking, he uprooted a blade of grass. It doesn't matter. He uprooted this blade of grass without any intention. And therefore, if he has no intention, he is potter. And there's a number of other cases in the Gemara that the Gemara goes through, a number of other cases where Rabbi Shimon says a person who has no intention is always potter. Now, how does this help us understand this idea that the entire world could be potter from judgment? So the idea is as follows. It's a story I heard from the same place. It was actually from Y.Y. Jacobson, Rabbi Y.Y., and he said as follows. There was a story that he told about the Bobova Rebbe shortly after the Holocaust. The Bobova Rebbe and his son managed to survive Auschwitz and the camps, and eventually he came to America. And he established his basis in Manhattan at that time. And as you can imagine, Manhattan at that time was not heavily populated by religious Jews. And he had difficulty, the first Shabbos that he was there, he had difficulty finding a minyan. In fact, there were only 9 people that they managed to scrape together, and there was no, they couldn't find a 10th. So the Bobova Rebbe, Reb Shlomo Halberstam, tells his son Naftali, go out and see if you can find a Yid in the street that's willing to join us for the tefillah. So the son goes out and he walks around in downtown Manhattan, and he's looking around for for a Yid, and he sees someone in the distance. He's not wearing a yarmulke, and he doesn't have a beard, and he doesn't want tzitzis or anything like that, but he has a Jewish panim, he has a Jewish face. So he says to him in Yiddish, just to make sure, he asks him, Bist du Yid? And the person answers, Vade bin ich Yid. Of course I'm Jewish. And the Naftali tells him, he asks him, maybe you want to join us to make a minyan. So he says, okay, beseder, darfst du wissen, ich bin euch der Chazen, and you should know I'm also a Chazen. So as soon as they get into the shul, they have the 10th man. Rabbi Naftali goes over to his father, to the Bobova Rebbe, and he whispers in his ear, and he says he's a chazan. Maybe we should, in order to thank him for for coming to make the minyan, maybe we should give him the amud. Afapi that doesn't have a yarmulke. Of course, they gave him a yarmulke and so on. And the Bobova Rebbe said, yeah, tell him, let him down from the amud. It turns out the guy had a beautiful voice, and he was indeed a chazan. Yeah, and they gave him the amud, and he davened, and they thanked him very much and invited him to come back, and he did. Next week he came back again, and again and again. A few times he came back, and then other people started coming to the minyan. They heard the Bobova Rebbe was there. They made arrangements. They came, etc., and they were mashlim the minyan. So they didn't really need him anymore for the minyan, but he came a couple more times, and then he stopped coming. So it didn't come 1 week, it didn't come a second week, a third week. The Bobova Rebbe turns to his son one Shabbos afternoon, and he says to him, what happened to that fellow that used to come and join the minyan? He was a chazan. I don't know, says Rabbi Naftali. I don't know what happened to him. Says the Bobova Rebbe, go out to see if you can see him around. He obviously lives in the area. Maybe you'll find him somewhere around. So Rabbi Naftali goes and spazier on Shabbos afternoon. He goes out for a walk on Shabbos afternoon. He's walking around. He has his gabbai with him, and there, as they're walking through a park, they see this fellow. He's sitting. He's reading a newspaper, and he's smoking a cigarette on Shabbos afternoon. So Rabbi Natali goes back to his father and he says, "It's not shaykh to invite him back. We saw him smoking on Shabbos. Mechal Shabbos b'Parhesia. He's being Mechal Shabbos. He's breaking Shabbos in public." So the Baba Rebbe says, "No, it's not him. He's not doing it." So Rabbi Natali says, "Father, I want to contradict you, but we saw him smoking on Shabbos, both of us." So he said, "No, it's not him. It's not him smoking. It's the goy in him that's smoking. It's not him." So go and invite him back and let him join us for tefillah. So they went again. They invited him. They found him on the bench. They invited him to come back, and eventually he came back a couple more times, but eventually they didn't see him again. No, fast forward 35 years later, the whole story is forgotten, the whole incident is forgotten. And one day the Baba Rebbe says to his son, I was invited to Sheva Brochas in New Jersey, and I want you to come with me. So the son says, who's Sheva Brochas? Says, you'll see when we get there. So off they go to the Sheva Brochas, they come to this house where the Sheva Brochas is being held. And as soon as they walk in, an elderly man stands up and he comes over and he hugs the Baba Rebbe and he thank you, Rebbe, for coming in. And he sits him at the head table and so on and so forth. And then the Baba Rebbe turns to his son, to Rav Naftali, and he says, "You see, I told you it wasn't him smoking. It was the goy. It was the goy smoking on Shabbos." What did he mean by that? This person apparently turned his life around and he started slowly keeping Shabbos and everything else. And he had children and he instructed them in the right way and their children's children. And here they were at the granddaughters, at this man's granddaughters, Sheva Brochas, and they were making a proper Sheva Brochas as though he dav to Zan, as it's properly, it's supposed to be done properly, and so on and so forth. He obviously wasn't a Baba B'Chosid yet, but nevertheless, he was a Frum Yid, and all of his children who were there, they all looked Frum with, with beards and with shaitels and so on and so forth. And Baruch Hashem, so he said, you see, it's not him, it was the Goy. So let's transpose the story to the idea of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. When Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai says a person is potter or it's mutter to do what he does because he's not miskaven, he doesn't have intention, that's really what happens. That's the truth is, when a Yid does an Aveira, when a Yid does something that is not Alpi Torah and Alpi Din, it's not him doing it. Say, it's a horror, it's this, it's that, it's not him. His intention is to do what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants him to do. It just he's not listening right now, and he doesn't realize right now. He's not there. He's not with it. He's not doing it with intention, lahachis, to anger HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He's doing it simply because he doesn't. He either doesn't know any better, or he's not thinking at this particular point in time. But if you remind him, and you remind him gently, and you remind him in the right way, and you remind him kindly, and so on and so forth, he'll come to the realization that he too is a ben or a bat of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, a son or a daughter of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and therefore he'll start acting in the right way. Now, one of the inyonim that we see from the Rebbe was exactly this same kind of thing. We see the insistence that the inner core of a Yid is a chelek elokah mimal mamash, not only from the Rebbe, but from all of the Rebbeim. You find it in Tanya, chelek elokah mimal mamash. The inner core of a Yid is a chelek elokah, is part of God above, and therefore, since that is the case, it's not possible that he can go against the HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's not possible. It's the chitzonius that goes against the HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's the outer aspect. It's the goy shebekir boy. It's not him himself who's doing these aveiros. There's a story in the Zohar itself that illustrates this idea. There were two of the Talmidim, two of the great Talmidim of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, Rabbi Yosei and Rabbi Chia, went to Miron to be mishtateach al the kever, to do ishtatchus on the kever, on the burial place of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. They went to Miron. And it doesn't say what day they went. Maybe it was Lag Bohema, maybe it wasn't Lag Bohema, but Al Kompanim, they went to be mishtatech on the kever. And both of them expressed tremendous longing to once again be with Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. And Rabbi Chia made a hachlota at that particular time. He made a hachlota. He made a decision that, come what may, he's going to do whatever he can to hear a Torah from Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, whether he would hear it while he was awake or whether he would hear it while he was asleep, but he would get a vision or hear a Torah from Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. So he fasted for 40 days. And after he finished the 40-day fast, a voice came out from heaven and said, "You're not zoche to see Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai." He fasted another 40 days. And then at the end of that 40 days, he felt the malachim coming, and the malachim lifted him up, and they lifted him up to the Mesifta, the Rekia, to the yeshiva Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. And the Zohar describes over there that there's many different yeshivas in Shamayim. One of them is the Mesifta of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. So the angel lifts him up to there, and he says, "You can see from a distance. I won't let you in, but you'll be able to see Rabbi Shimon from a distance." So as soon as Rabbi Shimon sees his stymied, Rabbi Chia, he says, let him in, bring him in. And the Malach, B'leis Breira, no choice, he lets Rabbi Chia come into Rabbi Shimon's presence. As Rabbi Chia enters, all the Chachamim stand up in Shamayim. We talk about in Gan Eden. Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai himself stands up. Rabbi Elazar and all the other Talmidim who had already passed away by this time all stand up for the honor of Rabbi Chia. Now, Rabbi Chia was very embarrassed by this because he felt that he wasn't a Chacham on the Madrega of, certainly on the Madrega of his Rebbe and his Rebbe's son, Rabbi Elazar, and so on and so forth. He wasn't, so he was very embarrassed and he hung his head in shame. And the angel brought him to the feet of Rabbi Shimon, and he sat down at the feet of Rabbi Shimon. Everyone else sat down, and so on and so forth. And Rabbi Shimon started teaching Torah, and he heard some of the Torahs that he was so longing to hear at that particular time. And then he heard a voice that came from behind the mechitza. There was a mechitza in the base medrash, in Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai's base medrash, and from behind the mechitza, the voice said, "Man minchon, any one of you who has not the law mahapchen meriru lemiska, any one of you who has not transformed bitterness into sweetness, v'chashoicha linhoira, and darkness into light, Ad lo yesun hocha, is not allowed to come in here." So Rabbi Chia understood that this was a teaching for him, that the way to get to the Mesifta of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai is to transform darkness into light and sweetness and bitterness into sweetness. And what does that mean? That means to be able to look into another Yid, and instead of seeing the darkness, you see the light, the neshama, the chelek ol hamimal. Instead of seeing the bitterness of Golus and the bitterness of a person's life. Everyone goes through bitter periods in their own life. To be able to see the sweetness and to bring it out and to let the sweetness overcome the bitterness and transform it into sweetness. That's how we get to the Mesifta of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Just as this was happening, the mamuna, the malach in charge of the whole, the Mesifta, the sort of the doorman of the Mesifta said, "Everybody stand up, Mashiach is coming in." Right, Mashiach is coming. So everybody stands up. Mashiach comes into the base medrash, and they explain to Rabbi Chia that Mashiach comes to the base medrash of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai every night. In truth, he comes to the base medrash of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai last, because he goes to all the other Bata Midrashas that there are in Gan Eden, and he ratifies, first of all, he teaches the Rosh Yeshivas, a Torah every night, that the Rosh Yeshivas of the Beis Din Shel Maila, of the Yeshiva Shel Maila, of all the yeshivas in heaven, in Gan Eden, he teaches them a Torah, and then they teach it to their Talmidim, and that seeps through somehow or another, if a person is worthy, down into this world, so that the Rosh Yeshivas down below in this world will be Mechadash a Torah that I think it's a Chidush, but really it's coming from the teachings of Mashiach in Shamayim. But after this happens, then Mashiach has to go around to every base medrash to make sure that the teachings before that can be disseminated, that the teaching is correct according to what he said. So there's only 3 yeshivas where he doesn't have to do that, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself ratifies those Torahs. One is the yeshiva of Chizkiyahu HaMelech, interestingly enough. Another one is the yeshiva of Achia HaShiloini. And the third one is the yeshiva of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. That in those 3 yeshivas, he doesn't have to ratify their Torahs because HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself ratifies their Torahs. Then Mashiach turns to Reb Chia and he says to her, he says,
What do you mean by ratify? What does it mean?
Say again, I'm sorry?
What does it mean in these 3 yeshivas? He doesn't have to do what?
He doesn't have to ratify, he doesn't have to give a gushpanka, a chotemet, to their teachings, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself gives a gushpanka. He says their teachings are emes and they don't need my stamp of approval. They don't need my stamp of approval. They're already approved. They're pre-approved in those 3 yeshivas. So then Mashiach say again?
What is the word in Hebrew that is used in the Gemara?
It's not in. This is not a Gemara. It's in the Zohar. And the Zohar, the Hakdama to the Zohar, Daf Daled Amud Aleph. The word there used is a gushpanka, which means a chotemet in Hebrew. Chotemet, yeah, like a chotem. All right, a chotemet. In any event, then Mashiach turns to the Chachomim in the base Medrash and he points to Reb Chia and he says, "Who is this?" So they said, "This is the famous Rabbi Chia from wherever he was from, the famous Rabbi Chia." So he says, "Yeah, I know it's Rabbi Chia, but what's he doing up here in a goof?" So they say he came for a visit. He came for a visit. So Mashiach turns to Rabbi Chia and he says, "Efshe, you want to stay? Maybe you want to stay in the yeshiva of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai." Immediately, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai says, "Now he has work to do down below. He has work to do in disseminating the inyan of Pnimis Torah." And eventually, Rabbi Chia finds himself back down in his home, in his house, and he realizes that he has a shlichus to do, and that shlichus is to disseminate the teachings of his master, of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, the teachings of Pnimis Torah. And the Rebbe actually concludes with when he speaks about this idea, the Rebbe mentions that the teachings of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, as it says itself in the Zohar, Bahai Chibura Dilach, with this sefer of yours, in other words, the sefer of Zohar, Nafkin min gelusa berachamim. We will go out of galus, but not stam go out of galus, but berachamim. We'll do it with compassion and in a positive way, and so on and so forth. In other words, in a deserving way. Why in a deserving way? Because Rabbi Shimon will be able to find and be able to prove to everybody in their own right that they are a chelek elokah mimal mamish, and everybody will realize I'm a chelek elokah, and then mamela there won't even be necessary to liftor es kol ha'olam kulam min adin, because there won't be din anymore. Everyone will be righteous mitzad the etzma the neshama, mitzad the inyan of Rabbi Shimon, who reveals the teachings of Rabbi Shimon all the way through the Harizal and the Rebbeim and so on and so forth, that bring out the etzem pnimius of a yid that is always connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and not only connected, but a chelek elokah mimal. Okay, that's the word.
Really, really, really interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, have a wonderful